people should be free to use whatever they want as money. That could be Bitcoin, it could be seashells. So I don't think the government has a right to enforce that people use a certain currency. So that's one way that the government can manipulate, coerce people, is by saying that you have to use a certain kind of currency, and if you don't accept it, then there can be legal penalties against you, and they can use this power to manipulate people, and they have to inflate the currency and fund all these government programs by printing money, which cause inflation. Like you used to be able to buy dinner for a nickel or a dime, right? Like 100 years ago or something, and now, right, that's unheard of, right? You can't even buy a bottle of Coke for a nickel or a dime. So there's been massive inflation since the government has created the Federal Reserve System and created fiat currency. So I do think it is a violation of rights for the government to just print fiat money.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everyone. This is Jack Allwild with another Money episode. Today, we have very special guest, Dan Norton. You can find him at Dan Norton1 on YouTube and at Dan Norton111 on X. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, I wanted to have you on to discuss what capitalism is and what capitalism is not. And I reach out to you for the listeners. You list that you're an Ayn Rand fan, you're a philosophy PhD, and it says contact me for a discussion or debate. So that's how I reached out to you. So I thought a good place to start would be to just read a definition that I've kind of been using, or at least recently when I was kind of like thinking about this. So there was a book my brother and I read for the Brothers on Books podcast called The Uncommunist Manifesto by Alex Svetsky and Mark Moss. And what I liked about this book, and it's a very small, they kind of tried to make it like the Communist Manifesto, just a very short, small book. And they spend like the first 15 pages just going over definitions. And I think it's so important because a lot of times when I'm talking, I even start questioning, do I even know like a word that I'm using? So that's kind of why I wanted to iron out some thoughts and ideas with you. But I'm going to just read the definition they have, and forgive me, it's kind of long, but it said, okay, so capitalism, perhaps the most misunderstood of all the words in this list. Capitalism is simply another word for progress, innovation, or evolution. Capitalism is not a system of rules, or politics. It is an organic process that happens in all living or complex systems. It is inherently apolitical. No body is in charge of it, nor can there be forms of political capitalism. Capitalism just is. When we subtract all of the political definitions projected on it, we find that it is simply the natural process of taking resources and turning them into something of higher order, quality, or value. All systems of rule, order, and organization, even socialism and communism, have capitalism in them. The question is simply to what degree is this natural process allowed to occur, and to what degree does politics and the short sighted human desire to control everything get in the way? Capitalism's forcing functions are efficiency and effectiveness, its corrective mechanism is loss, and its positive feedback loop is growth. So that's the definition in this book, at least. So I kind of just like, so I know I didn't provide this to you, and I kind of wanted just like your spur of the moment feedback. Like, how do you feel reading that definition of capitalism?
Well, first of all, there's a question of how much of it do I even remember. I don't think that is a
Okay.
definition of like it wouldn't be for any word a definition of that style. It's more like a paragraph. It's a description. Um, it's too long to be a definition for one thing, and it has too many parts, multiple sentences. So to really function as a definition, it has to be much briefer and just state the essence of a system, uh, uh,
Okay.
of the term. So for any word, that would be too long. But if we somehow convert that description into like a super long sentence, maybe with a bunch of
Huh?
conjunctions like the word and,
Okay.
um, I still think it's probably not right because like part of it that I remember from what you were reading is that it was saying it's not a political system. I think capitalism is a political system. You could also say it's an economic system. Sometimes I've heard it, I've seen it hyphenated, like it's a political hyphen economic system. It could also be defined as a social system. I think that's the term Ayn Rand uses in her definition. Um, so that I would want to hear it again to give a more of a take on it, but I think it could be thought of as a political system. And I guess the definition is far too long to retain.
Uh, okay.
And if I saw it written down, I would have more time to process it and I could give you more feedback on it. But those are just a couple quick thoughts off the top
Okay.
of my head.
Okay. So, like, if someone were to ask you, what is capitalism? How would you respond?
Okay, well, sometimes when I am asked that, I give Ayn Rand's definition,
Hmm.
and I can read that to you.
Okay.
It's the following, quote, capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned, unquote.
Okay. Okay, because that was going to be my first question because I normally associate property rights with capitalism, and so by your definition, you are explicitly stating because in this definition I just read, there was no mention of property rights. So that was one of the first spots I wanted to touch on. So would you so I guess by your definition, property rights is like part of capitalism.
Yes, I think it is part of capitalism. I don't think it's the only part, but it is an important part. I think maybe the reason she includes that aspect of capitalism in the definition is to distinguish it from other well-known social systems like communism or
Mhm.
socialism, in which there is no private property, and it's not the case that all uh, property is privately owned. Rather, it's owned by the state or the
Mhm.
nation rather than by individuals or individual groups of individuals like businesses, corporations. So it functions, that aspect of the definition functions as a differentiator to distinguish capitalism from other social systems. That's something that you want to have as a feature of definitions, is to something that will help distinguish it from the other neighboring concepts like
Mhm.
socialism or communism.
Yeah, that's an
Um,
interesting
yeah.
point because when I was reading through these definitions in this Uncommunist Manifesto, the definition for communism is very short, and they just use the Karl Marx, I guess, definition, and it may be summed up in the abolition of property, private property, and that's all it says. So I was surprised they didn't say anything with private property because I kind of view capitalism and communism on opposite sides, but maybe that's not the right way to look at it necessarily.
I think it's a reasonable way to look at it.
Okay.
Um, yeah, because if capitalism, all property is privately owned, and communism, no property is privately owned. It's all owned by the state. And I guess any property you use is used by permission of the state, and it can be revoked at any time if it's deemed uh, for the public good or the good of the nation that this property is taken away, then that can be done. So you only use it by permission rather than by right. Um, so I think it's definitely reasonable to see them as being on opposite ends of a spectrum. There could also be something like a mixed economy, which I think is actually the term that applies to the United States and many other countries in the world today, where it's a very heavy mixture. You have large elements of freedom, but you also have large elements of coercion by the state, where the state is forcing you to do certain things, to use your property in certain ways. For instance, in the U.S., we've got programs like Social Security and Medicare, and which are funded by taxation. So a hunk of your paycheck or your income is not up to you to decide. You don't have private ownership of it. It belongs to the state, effectively.
Mhm.
It's taken away from you. So I don't think we have a system of capitalism in the United States And I don't think there ever has been pure capitalism where there's no state intervention at all
Hmm.
in the economy. But I think there was something at least much closer to pure capitalism back in the 19th century of the
Hmm.
United States.
So to that point about not having pure capitalism, can capitalism like exist without a state or someone to enforce contracts and property rights? Like
I
what
don't,
would be
yeah.
pure capitalism, I guess?
It would be a social system in which there is a state, there is a government, so it's not anarchy.
Hmm.
And I would want to make that distinction clear because a lot of people, um, libertarians actually, are often, sometimes I get called a libertarian, very often actually, but I try to distinguish myself from libertarians and say I'm not a libertarian because many libertarians are anti-state. They don't think there should be a state at all, or if they do think there should be a state or a government, they would say there should be private competing governments, not just one government with a monopoly on the use of force. Um, but capitalism, as I understand that, is a system with a government, but the government's role is restricted to the role of protecting individuals from force, from physical force or coercion. And there's three basic ways it does that. So one way is by having a military, which protects individuals within the country from foreign threats, right? So if some other country like Russia or China tries to invade, we have a military to protect us from their use of force against us. The second, after the military, is the police, which is basically the same thing but domestically. So police protect us from people who would use force within the country, not invaders, but like robbers, rapists, murderers who go around the streets and cause havoc. The police protect us from domestic force. And then third and finally, there's a court system, which is a way of peacefully settling disputes between people within the country so they don't have to resort to force. Like if you have a dispute with your neighbor over, where exactly does your property end and his property begins, you don't have to fight it out. You don't have to have a duel or a gunfight and try to settle it that way by force. You can settle it by peaceful means, and a court system allows people to do that. So those are the three and the only three functions, essentially the only three in a capitalist system, as I would understand it.
Mhm.
That would
And
be a
that,
purely capitalist system. So there would
yep.
not be these huge programs, government programs like Social Security or Medicare, which take money from some people out of their paychecks and then distribute it to others to fund their retirement, to fund their medical care. There's not going to be public education, which forces people to fund other people's education. All businesses are private, and the only proper function of the government is to protect people from force via those three functions that I mentioned.
Mhm. So okay, a couple things. So the third part about resolving disputes, like business contracts would fall under that too, right? Like, you say you're going to pay me, and then I tell you I'm going to provide you some good or service. And if one of us doesn't follow through, then we go to court, I guess, if instead of force.
Right. Yeah, you don't take the law into your own hands and try to mete out vigilante justice.
Hmm.
That would reduce society to a state of anarchy, basically.
Uh-huh.
Like you maybe Somalia is a good example, just some kind of failed state where you have these warring gangs, and you can try to enforce justice as you see it, and then there could be another gang down the street that enforces its form of justice. So I think if you don't have a peaceful court system like that, something like anarchy is the result, and I think that's bad for everyone. It's
Hmm.
not a safe kind of society to live in where your rights are protected. That's another
Hmm.
core concept, the rights, which might be good to talk about a little bit. Just to say briefly, there's something called the Ayn Rand lexicon, which has
Okay.
it's like a glossary of definitions. Well, not just
Okay.
definitions, but little descriptions or blurbs from her excerpts from her writings on key concepts. And I just found the definition of right that I was going to look that I was looking for it. So she says, quote, a right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context, unquote.
Okay.
And there's more, but
Mhm.
rights define what you are free to do in a social context. So she goes on to explain how the only way you can violate a right is through physical force. So um, I think that's in this passage. In any case, this is part of her
Okay.
view. Um, so you have a right to do anything you please as long as you're not initiating physical force against someone else. So if I want to
Okay.
deal with you, um, I can like let's say that you have something that I want like I think you've got a really nice motorcycle or something and I want that. Well, I can make you an offer. I can say if I give you $5,000, will you give me your motorcycle? That would be respecting your rights. I'm leaving up to your voluntary choice as to what to do. But what I don't have a right to do is to just swipe it, to,
Mhm.
trespass on your property and then take it without your consent. That would be a violation of your rights. And that's the only way, essentially, to violate someone's rights is to override their voluntary consent and take something or interact with them by force rather than by reason or persuasion.
Mhm. So this is interesting. You mentioned it's got to be like a physical type of but how would Ayn Rand see like patents? Like when someone comes up with an idea or a product, and then maybe another company wants to use that in their process, or so how do we view patents and building on prior generations' ideas?
Okay, first, I'll recommend an article. She has an article called, I think it's called Patents and Copyrights,
Okay.
and she discusses this in that article.
Okay. Cool.
But she does believe in them for one thing, or she does support intellectual property. I think a lot of libertarians are opposed to intellectual property. I'm not too familiar with their views, but I guess the first thing to say is just that there are such things as patents and copyrights in a proper system, and they are ways of protecting the work of your mind. So you you come up with some invention, you use your mind to come up with some idea, and then you embody it in some product. I think there has to be some kind of physical implementation, or at least the possibility of physical implementation to be. I don't know if it's maybe that's for patents or like with ideas. If you write them down, you can copyright a book, an article, but I don't I don't know that you can just copyright an idea, a purely
Mhm.
intellectual phenomenon that's not been put into some kind of physical form like a book or an
Mhm.
article. If you just come up with an idea, you can, I guess you could spread it, and then someone, even if you haven't written a book or an article, someone should at least give you credit for it, like not plagiarize your idea. That's a little different than I think patents and copyrights are. Like if you're a student writing a paper, you don't want to plagiarize your sources. You want
Mhm.
to give credit. You should give credit and not pretend as though you were the one who originated some idea.
Mhm.
But I think plagiarism is, I'm not sure it's exactly in the same category as patents and copyrights. I think it might be a
Mhm.
little bit different. But in any case, we survive by the use of our minds. That's a fundamental point in Ayn Rand's philosophy. And if we can't benefit from the use of our minds. Like, I mean, all the technology we come up that's been invented, like the Zoom, which we're using right now, to have this conversation, that required a lot of work, a lot of thinking to figure out how to create this product. And if people can't benefit from their thinking, like if the CEO of Zoom is not allowed to make money off his product, that someone else can just swipe it, take the same idea or the same technology, and get all the physical benefits himself, all the money, then there's not going to be an incentive for anyone to produce anything because they're not able to. There's no profit motive if they can't benefit from the use of their mind and the
Hmm.
implementation of their ideas. So,
Hmm.
in order to protect people's ability to live, um, we need something like patents and copyrights. Because if you can't benefit from the use of your minds, um, then that infringes on your ability to survive. And the
Hmm.
fundamental right, in Ayn Rand's view, is the right to life. And if it, you can't exercise that right if um, the products of your mental effort are not ultimately coming back to benefit you, if they're just siphoned off and other people can take them.
Uh-huh.
So
So,
that might have been a bit hazy or unclear, but I tried to indicate at least where the grounding, the justification for something like
uh-huh.
patents or copyrights.
Like I think the part I get tied up in with this, what you're describing, because like, okay, so Zoom created this, but we also have like Skype, we have like in Google you can do a video meet, and like I always come back to like when Uber came out, it seemed like Lyft came out very quickly after, and I kind of so my brother is a chemist and he often talks about drugs getting patents and how they're protected. I mean, I don't really know, but it seems like certain types of products are protected more than others. Like, do you have any thoughts on like that? Like, how do we determine whether like I mean, is it just competition coming in to compete, or are we really like taking someone else's idea?
I think it can get pretty complicated when you might have to talk to a patent attorney if you want to get more into the details on this. Actually, there is someone, Adam Mossoff is
Okay.
he's a law professor who specializes in intellectual property. So
Okay.
he could, I'm sure he could talk a lot more about this topic than I can. Um, but as to where exactly a patent ends, like if Zoom wants to patent its product, exactly what are the parameters of that? Um, like, do you have to maybe Zoom has certain features which Skype doesn't have? So I think Skype existed first, and
Okay.
then later Zoom came along, and I don't know if it was a more web-friendly kind of video conferencing or what. I don't know what the feature of
Hmm.
it was that made it very popular, but there has to be something to differentiate it from pre-existing products. It can't just be a straight copy if there's a patent on the prior product. But I guess
Uh-huh.
when you have to file a patent with the government, and I guess in your application you have to indicate what exactly is the key feature or features of this thing, which can't be implemented by some other company. And also, maybe the duration of it is also an issue. Like maybe you can have exclusive rights to produce products with a certain feature for 10 years or 20 years. I don't know what it is. Maybe it varies from product to product, from industry to industry. And then after that period, other people can come in and start using the same features or putting them in their product. So if you want to get into the nitty gritty, I can't give you like details on that,
Uh-huh.
but it should all be indicated in contracts exactly what are the limits
Hmm.
of patents and
Hmm.
what is and is not an infringement.
Hmm. I mean, do you have any thoughts on like, because yeah, it just seems so arbitrary to me sometimes. Like, this type of product is protected for like 7 years, or like and like sometimes, and I think what kind of frustrates some people is like, for example, like a drug company might use a software um, that was maybe produced by some sort of government funding, and then the drug company produces a drug based on that software, but they get to have a patent on their product. So it's a bit of socializing the investment and then privatizing the gain. Any thoughts on something like that?
Um, Let me come back to that. I just had one
Okay,
other thought on
sure, sure.
a prior point you just mentioned the use of the term arbitrary is
Hmm.
um, so I think there might be some maybe optionality is a term that could also be used instead of arbitrary. So
Okay.
just by analogy, the age of majority, like when exactly do you become an adult? Well, in the United
And,
States, it's 18. But other countries, it's different. Like some, it's 16, I think, and some it's 21. So, but in none is it 5, right? So,
mhm.
um, it's not it's not totally arbitrary. It's not just randomly set. There is a clear distinction between a 5-year-old and a 55-year-old in terms of maturity and whether it's an adult. But exactly where do you draw that line? Is it
Mhm.
16? Is it 18? Is it 21? I think there's some optionality there. And I think
Okay.
likewise with patents, should we say that, a patent lasts for 20 years or 15 years, 25 years? There might be some optionality there. Should we say it lasts for 3 days? That
Yeah.
seems clearly wrong, right? Someone might have invested like 10 years of his life into creating something, and you're only going to give him exclusive rights for 3 days. No, that's clearly wrong. So I don't
Oh.
think it's arbitrary, but I think there is some optionality as to where exactly a given system, and for different countries, they might draw the line in different places. And I don't think you can really get around there being some variation in exactly how long patents last.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
go ahead. Looks like you want to reply to that.
Well, you said something that made me think of, and I've kind of talked with this with some people too on like like an athlete, for example. Like I know a lot of people say like the investment is so much they should be protected for, like 7 years if they come up with this product because the investment is so high. But I often think of like athletes that spend like, over a decade working on a skill, and they have no there's no guarantee ever that something's going to be produced or you'll be able to show something at the end. So I sometimes have trouble like thinking about that in terms of why is one protected but like an athlete, for example, like it's they invest so much time to getting that skill, and that is what they think their livelihood will be, and that's not able to be protected.
Well, I do think it's important that it's all voluntary. So you have to know going in what the risks are. You have to know that, yeah, I might be spending 10 years of my life trying to become a great basketball player, but there's no guarantee that anyone's going to draft me into the NBA at the end of that. So as long as you know that going in, that's the situation, then I think it's fair. So I guess with patents, I guess if you know that if you want your work protected, you've got to go to the patent office and file an application or whatever the procedure is. You can't just hope that no one is going to come along and replicate your idea, that no one's going to compete with you. There's a process you have to go through, and so you have to take certain steps, like maybe you have to be somewhat secretive about your activities for a while so the word doesn't get out. And then you have to be you have to take care to go through the steps like filing your patent application so that your work doesn't, all the benefit doesn't go to someone else. So, but you know the rules of the game going in. You
Mhm.
know that there are these steps that you have to go through. So, given that it's all known in advance what the rules of the game are, and then you choose whether or not to
Mhm.
participate in them,
Mhm.
I think it's a fair system.
So if one country has one set of rules and another country has another set, and like I think to like Toyota, I think Toyota was kind of started I believe he like basically came over to America, basically bought a car and then kind of reverse engineered it. I might be getting that slightly wrong, but when you have a different country with different rules, how do we kind of grapple with maybe they being able to reverse engineer something? And is it like your domestic government's like duty at that point to protect the citizens and their intellectual, I guess, endeavors and products?
That's an interesting question, which I haven't thought much about that. So yeah, countries can have different rules. I think they should all fundamentally have the same rules, which is not the case though. But and that can make things complicated. But just to kind of build on a point I was making in the last segment, I was saying that as long as you know the rules going in, it's a fair system because you choose whether or not to participate. But then I was thinking after I said that, well, th that doesn't mean like any country can set any rules and it's valid. Like if some country says, "Oh, we're going to have slavery," or "We're going to, you know, we're going to have taxes," um, and you know the rules, you know that in this country we've got slavery or taxes, and you choose whether, well, I guess if you're not in the country, maybe you could choose whether or not to go to that country. Um, but I don't think that that a country has the rights to create certain rules. I think the point of a government is to protect rights. So, and a government is not doing that. It's actually doing the opposite. It's infringing rights with something like slavery or taxes. So there are certain rules, you might call them, which I do think are illegitimate for anywhere. It doesn't matter where you go. And the reason they're illegitimate is just because of the nature of rights and the nature of ethics. It gets into more fundamental issues in philosophy. So I guess there are some limitations on this idea that as long as you know the rules of the game, it's a fair system. There have to be certain limitations on the rules. Namely, the rules have to respect individual rights. This principle that says it's wrong to initiate force against others. If it respects that rule, then within that constraint, I think you could say it's a fair system.
Mhm.
Um,
But I guess you would say like so like let's say um you would say it's not fair if like a drug company comes up with a drug they think their patent's going to last 7 years and then the rules change to like 4 years. Like that would be unfair, I guess, because they started with one assumption of the rules and now the rules have changed.
yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
Um, you can't just arbitrarily on a whim change the
Uh-huh.
rules because people they they didn't consent to that. They consented to 7 years, and now you change it to we only have 4 years. Well, that's not what I consented to. Um,
Mm.
now, it's just made me think of something like Social Security, which I think is an illegitimate program because it coerces people to fund it via taxes. I do think that should be changed. It should be phased out, basically. I don't think it should be abolished overnight because people have been paying into the system for decades. Many will be reliant on that once they get to retirement. And if someone is in retirement now and you just take away all their Social Security, that's not fair to them. But it's also not fair to people who are just entering the system that they have to be funding their parents or their grandparents. I mean, that's not something they chose. So the whole system is not a system based on voluntary choice, and that's why it needs to be scrapped. but I don't think it should be scrapped overnight. So we're talking about changing the rules midstream. I was saying a minute ago, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't change it to like from 7 years to 4 years on a something like a patent. Um, but I do think it's reasonable to change something like Social Security because that was not a legitimate system in the beginning to begin with.
Mhm.
So, whereas I think something like patents are legitimate, something like Social Security I think needs to be phased out. And like right now, the rule is you start being eligible at age of 65, I think, or maybe at 67. It might have changed. Um, for your you're eligible at that point to receive Social Security. But I think we could phase out that program over time by saying like, well, if you're retired now or 65, then you'll get whatever was promised. But if you're 18, you're not going to get anything that was promised. But by the same token, you're not going to have to pay into the system. You're not going to get any benefits from it, but you're also not going to have to contribute to it. So just you have to be responsible, set aside money for your own retirement. They'll count on money from the government. And maybe if you're somewhere in the middle, like you're in your 40s, you've been paying in for a while. Maybe people like that will get half of the benefits they were promised, but also they will be taxed half as much going forward.
Mhm.
Um, so this is a way of trying to phase out an illegitimate system like Social Security. And it's a way of changing the rules, but I think given the context, I think it's valid to change
Mhm.
those rules, getting back to a
Okay.
system where um, no rights are being violated.
Okay. What other things would we cut out that are like coercive in your view?
The biggest ones are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I think those, I don't know what percentage of the um, budgets they account for, but I think it's likely over 50%. But it's trillions of dollars. And right now, I think Doge has been in the news in the last couple months since Trump took office. And I don't think that's really serious in terms of cutting what needs to be cut. It's kind of just tinkering around the edges, cutting a few billion here, a few million here from this program or that program. But we've got trillions of unfunded liabilities due to programs like Social Security and Medicare. Those are really where the action is if you want to get serious about reducing our trillions of debt and our unfunded liabilities. I think Social Security is projected to run out of funds within about a decade. Unless changes are made, like unless you tax people more or raise the retirement age, it's just going to run out of funds. So it's not financially sustainable, and it needs to change, or else you might eventually end up with a situation, like there was in Greece. I don't know, 10 or so years ago, they had their pension system. I think was it ran out of funds, and they had to get bailed out by I don't know if it was some other European country.
Sure. Yeah, Germany. Yeah.
Germany. Yeah, that sounds right. So if we don't want to get into a situation like that, we've got to reform the system.
Mhm.
But so you ask, what would I change? Those are the biggest ones, but there's much else that
Uh-huh.
also needs to go.
Mhm. And how would I mean, tell me if this is so is printing more money like through central banking, is that a violation of property rights?
Yes, assuming that's the money being printed is fiat currency, like it's
Mhm.
designated as money that people have to accept as discharging a debt. It has to be accepted as legal tender. I think that's the term. Um, People should be free to use whatever they want as money. That could be Bitcoin, it could be seashells. Um, so I don't think the government has a right to enforce that people use a certain currency. So that's one way that the government can manipulate, coerce people is by saying that you have to use a certain kind of currency, and if you don't accept it, then there can be legal penalties against you, and
Mhm.
they can use this power to manipulate people, and they have to inflate the currency and
Yeah.
fund all these government programs by printing money, which cause inflation. Like
Yeah.
you used to be able to buy dinner for a nickel or a dime, right? Like 100 years ago or something. And now, right, that's unheard of, right? You can't even buy a bottle of Coke for a nickel or a dime. So there's been massive inflation since the government has um, created the Federal Reserve System and created fiat currency. Um, so I do think it is a violation of rights to for the government to just print fiat money.
Mhm. So then we could also say like central banking is uncapitalistic or not capitalistic.
Yeah, I think private banking is the way to go, not
Hmm.
government banking. In the U.S., I don't think ever had it's had at least closer to private banking in the 19th century, but even then, like when the country started, there was the first Bank of the United States, there was the second Bank of the United States. Greenbacks were issued during the Civil War. In the late 19th century, I guess there was I'm not sure what the status of the banking system was, but I think it was still regulated to some extent. Like there was, I think it might have been. There's an economist by the name of George Selgin who I think is a good source on the history of banking. Larry White is another one. He's done a lot of research on this, and he's shown how the banking system, even in the 19th century, um, was regulated. Sometimes people point to that period and say, "Oh, well, given the problems of the so-called free market in the 19th century, that gave justification for the creation of something like the Federal Reserve System, because allegedly capitalism had failed." But there wasn't capitalism even in the banking industry. There were regulations. I think one of them might have been you can't do branch banking, what was called branch banking,
Hmm.
where like you have banks in different states. I don't know exactly what the rules were, but you couldn't bank across state lines or something, and that limited the flexibility of what banks could do and where they hold their reserves. And but anyways, check out George Selgin. He's a better source on the kinds of regulations there were. Um, there were what's called wildcat banks, I guess that kind of has a free market flavor
Okay.
to it, but it really wasn't
Okay.
free market. And it caused, there were periodic runs on the banks and panics every now and then, even in the 19th century. But that's because, argues someone like Selgin, of these regulations on the banking system. In places like Scotland or Canada, there weren't these regulations on the banks, and they did much better. You didn't have these panics or runs on the banks. So those would actually be better models of what a free banking system looks like. And if you have that, um, I guess that pulls the rug out from the justification of something like a central bank. You really don't need it.
Cool.
And
Wow.
there's
Yeah.
been many, I mean, the Great Depression happened after the Federal Reserve Bank was established in what was it, 1916,
13, I thought,
13,
but yeah,
somewhere in
somewhere
there.
in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I, they can manipulate the interest rates, which can fuel irrational speculation. Um, and I think their intervention in the economy is what led to, or at least one of the things that led to the irrational speculation bubbles in the stock market, which then eventually crashed. If you had a more disciplined financial system, which you would have, and if in a system of free banking, you wouldn't have had that sort of irrational speculation
Mm.
or bubble.
Cool. Well, we're starting to come up on the hour. I did want to ask you, I mean, you sound very well read and you know a lot of stuff. You've mentioned a lot of people that will link in the um, description, but like what books really stick out to you in terms of really adding to your thoughtfulness?
Well, Ayn Rand is the most influential person on my thinking, so I would definitely recommend that people check out her work. She's most famous for her novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which they're not just novels, they also include original philosophy in them. And she provides an entirely new ethical code for human beings to live by. It has um, Aristotelian, she's heavily influenced by Aristotle. So it's not completely new, but it is a very strong departure from all prior thinking on ethics. She has very new insights to offer, um, but not just on ethics, also on politics, as we've been discussing more today with capitalism. So, in addition to her novels, she's written lots of nonfiction. So in particular, for this conversation, she's written a book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. That's a collection of essays which lays out the theory and the history of capitalism. So that would be a good source, I think, for people. And in that book, there's in the appendix there are two essays. One is called The Nature of Government, and the other is called Man's Rights. And that delves into some of what we've been discussing today. So those are good foundations. And then that book as a whole. And then aside from Ayn Rand, maybe one I'll mention is Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson,
Ah, it's a great book. Yeah.
which I haven't read the whole thing. I've read maybe half of it, but since it sounds like your audience is particularly interested in economic issues, financial issues, I think that might be a good one. I guess Ludwig von Mises, who I have not read, but I know was highly regarded by Ayn Rand, at least as far as his economics goes. I think there are other aspects of his view, like his deeper philosophy, maybe in epistemology or ethics, that she did not agree with and had strong disagreements with. But just as far as economics, I think she regarded him very highly, and she cites his works are cited more than anyone else's actually in her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So that's just
Mhm.
one other name I'll throw out there.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing those. And as we're winding down, if the listeners want to get in touch with you or want to learn more about you or watch your stuff, where should they go?
I have a YouTube channel, which I think was mentioned earlier, Dan Norton 1 on YouTube. And I'm also on other social media, X, Dan Norton 111. It's usually just some combination of ones, whatever hasn't already been taken by some other Dan Norton out there. Um, I'm on Facebook. That one is not actually not, well, I think it's dan.norton.1428. I think that was arbitrarily assigned to me when I first created my account. But these are all linked in my YouTube channel. So if you just go to my YouTube channel on the About section of my page, it has links to my X and my Facebook.
Okay.
Actually, there's two others I started recently, which don't have links yet on my YouTube channel. I put a few videos up on TikTok, on
Okay.
Instagram. But the main ones I've been using are YouTube and then Facebook and X. So yeah, I invite people to check me out there. And also, if you want to have a conversation or if you know someone else who does, I'm happy to do that. I recently started live streaming on my YouTube
Okay.
channel. So I have pre-recorded videos, but just about a month or so ago, I started doing live streams and I take calls through Zoom.
Okay.
So if you just
Oh,
go to my channel and during the day I do a live stream, I've been doing about twice a week, like Wednesday or uh, Saturday. So I'll probably do one tomorrow, actually. Well, we're recording this on a Friday. I don't know when this is going to be released, but um, and I might do more. I don't have a set schedule, but if you just subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll get notifications for when I go live. And if you ever want to call in, feel free to do so, or you can also just um, send me an email or something, and we can set something up. So,
cool. I'm curious, on your live streams, are you just like reading news and giving your thoughts, or what kind of stuff are you doing on your live streams?
It's very much a an experiment in progress. So I don't have
Okay.
a set format where I go through the news. Actually, Yaron Brook, who I think
Hmm.
some of your listeners might have heard of, he does a news kind of live stream
Yeah.
show on YouTube, and I listen to that a lot. And I definitely recommend him for someone who's interested in Ayn Rand's ideas. And I might do something more like that on my podcast, on my live stream in the future. I've done a little bit of that so far, but mostly it's just an opportunity to engage with people. So uh, through having people call into the show, I put a Zoom link in the chats and I just pin it at the top, so you'll see it there. But also just through text chat, that's a way to engage with people. So I just wanted to have another way for people to engage with me, and um, but I might turn it into more of a newsy kind of show where I have like a monologue at the beginning, um, or do reaction videos to other content. I
Mhm.
actually did one of those in my last live stream. But for right now, it's the bulk of it is just trying to get people to call in, have conversations like this one, right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I invite you to
Cool.
come by anytime.
Yeah, yeah.
Check it out.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for coming on, and thank you for helping us understand more what capitalism is and what it is not.
Sure thing. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.